We are back talking about legal due diligence. How do you protect your investments? What questions should you ask before you even put your money anywhere? Before we took the break, Patrick, you're telling us about pending litigation. What are the considerations? How do you find out if there's actually pending litigation in an investment that you're about to make?
So the good thing about pending litigation is that it is publicly available information.
Okay.
So the courts are public institutions, and anything that happens in the court is publicly available.
All right.
This may possibly be the easiest thing to find out if you just do a Google search of whatever business you want to invest in.
Yes.
Any litigation matters should boil up to the top.
Okay.
If they don't, you can just add KLR, which is Kenya Law Reports, to
Yes.
the end of your search, and that will just help those results come to you a bit quicker.
Okay. Yeah. And apart from anything to do with the law, is there an element of contingent liabilities? Could this person have somebody who wants to take them to court and hasn't gotten to court? Is there something that, is there a way we can find out? So
when we're looking at somebody who has the intention of taking them to court but hasn't yet taken them to court,
okay,
it would be upon them to disclose that.
Okay.
So what we're getting into is now the partnership, the agreement that you're going to enter into.
Yes.
As you're investing into the business, you do need to have a written down agreement stipulating the terms of the agreement.
All right.
And that agreement is also going to contain the warranties and representations of the parties.
Okay.
When I say warranties and representations, all I mean is the statements that the seller is making to the buyer to give them confidence in buying, and the statements that the buyer is making to the seller, assuring them that they are in fact capable of buying the business.
Of buying the business.
Yes.
Okay, that's interesting. So we're looking at the safeguards for you as an investor into a business. Now let's switch it up to the other side. We have a lot of ideation going on in Kenya, especially in the fintech space, where people are coming up with ideas and they have concepts and they're attracting foreign capital that wants to come into their company. What are the considerations for people in this space?
Well, I think the primary consideration would be dilution of the shares.
Okay.
So what I mean by dilution is if you own 50% of a business and somebody invests a lot of money into the business, you may need to yield some of your shares to that individual because of the amount of money that they've invested into your business.
Okay.
That leads to the dilution of the number of shares you have as the owner and proprietor of the business.
Which means, in other words, for instance, if I'm starting up a company today, you've brought out the element of paid up capital. So I could have 1,000 shares, but maybe I've only paid up for 500 shares.
Exactly.
So if the other person comes in and probably injects 1 million, if I'm not careful and I just receive the 1 million, I can automatically be diluted, and effectively, these people begin to make decisions on behalf of my company. Is that what you say?
Yes. So this person comes in and they want to invest into your business. Let's say the total value of your shares is 50 million. Okay. You have taken up shares worth 5 million.
Okay, wait. Before 50 million, let's say maybe I'm a startup, so I've come up with a concept. So I've put in, maybe I've put in 10,000 shillings.
Put in 10,000.
I've put in 10,000
okay.
shillings. So the valuation of the business, that's a different conversation. I could be valuing the opportunity, the future. I could be valuing it based on different things.
Okay.
For this person who's bringing in 10 million, how would I off the top of your head, how would I calculate their contribution to the business as it were in such a scenario?
For a business that is limited by shares,
yes,
it's a simple mathematical calculation.
Okay.
It is what is the value of one share?
Yes.
How much money have they brought in?
Yes.
How much, the money that they've brought in, how many shares does it entitle them to?
Okay.
Yeah.
So
depending on the total number of shares that they hold, if all of the shares are ordinary shares, it may entitle them to a greater stake of the business than you, the originator of the business.
That's very
which means that you will then lose decision-making power, you will then lose the ability to govern your own business.
Okay. And what about the element of sweat capital? How do people actually incorporate sweat capital in this particular structure? Because there's someone who will say, I have come up with the idea, I have the networks, I know the distribution if you're going to roll out a product or a service, but then you have the capital. So yours is quiet capital, mine is more of sweat capital. How do you balance the two? And is there a legal dynamic of making sure both parties are actually covered?
Well, we're now getting into the aspect of negotiation,
whereby
you're going to say, I did 1, 2, 3, which means that in as much as I did not put in capital, the things that I did have led to the business being in this position, which is a favorable position for the business, which then makes it an even better investment even for you as the investor.
Yes.
That then goes into the negotiation. How am I, as the owner of the business, going to negotiate my position and what I have put into the business so that you as the investor also see the value that I've been able to put across into the business?
Interesting.
Yes.
What you're just telling me is you need to talk to a person, a lawyer, if you're not going to transact with a bank.
It is important to talk to a legal professional.
It's imperative. Then also just continue on the same conversation. You mentioned an element of different classes of shares.
Definitely.
In the same scenario, please explain to us, what do different classes of shares mean and what powers would they have?
All right. When we're talking about different classes of shares, first off, there is no stipulation as to what the classes are. but there is a stipulation as to what they mean. So
Okay.
when we're looking at different classes of shares, the first class of shares is normally referred to as the voting right class. Those are the class of shares that are able to make decisions that impact the direction the company is going to take,
Okay.
and that impact how the company is going to be run and managed. The other class of shares are normally referred to as ordinary shares, which means that if you have them, you do have a stake in the business, but you do not have contribution into the leadership or governance of the organization.
Okay.
This is a brilliant way for you to insulate yourself if you're looking to take in capital and not lose control of the company.
So in the same scenario where you have somebody probably putting in more money, physical money than you have put in, can you give them ownership with non-voting rights?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
And what about the element of Class A shares? We've had such definitions. Is that something that's relevant to this conversation?
So when we're looking at Class A shares, that's again essentially the same thing. So
All right.
when we're looking at voting shares and ordinary shares, they don't have stipulated names. So they could be called Class A shares, Class B shares.
Okay.
They could be called specialty shares, regular shares. But all it means is that the particular class of shares has separate rights from the other
Okay.
class of
Okay.
shares. And as you're creating them, you're able to stipulate other rights into it. So for instance, if we're looking at a company that has gone into legal trouble,
Yes.
but has the Class A shares and the Class B shares, it can be stipulated in the memorandum and articles of the company that Class A shares will receive compensation first before
Class B shares.
That
Okay.
means that when it goes down, I, as a Class A shareholder, I will get paid first before any of the Class B shares
Okay.
get paid out.
Okay, so there are different structures. I mean, there are different elements. So it can be a
Yes.
Class A, I can be a Class B. It really just determines your preference to getting any point of recourse if you're a shareholder.
Exactly.
Then the other common one that we hear, and this is if I'm a company looking for investors to put their money in, there's preference shares and then there's ordinary shares. How do I look at preference shares and what's the use for preference shares?
So, again, it's exactly what we've talked about.
Okay, so the same thing. Okay,
Exactly.
fantastic. So I think my final question to you is this, because we have very many young people who are coming up with particularly very good concepts. And because of Kenya being identified as a Silicon Savannah, you see a lot of foreign capital coming here. But then the greatest grievance is actually this. So some people had an idea and they already knew what the value of this idea would be, but then they just opened up to foreign capital and it came in. And either they didn't understand the nature or the terms of engagement, but you find this person who's running a company today in a year's time is no longer affiliated with that company, yet they were the founders. How do we look at that and how do we actually avoid such a scenario?
So such a scenario is definitely very tragic because a lot of times when the vision bearer leaves the company, it tends to lose direction.
Okay.
So you find that if the person who originated the idea or originated the concept is pushed out of the organization, that then tends to impact the life cycle of the organization. There are two things that you need to look at when you're considering protecting yourself or insulating your rights in that particular situation.
Okay.
One is the concept of how are you taking in that money? As you're taking in that money, do you only have ordinary shares, which means that if they have more shares than you do, they then have the controlling right of the organization?
Okay.
An easy way to do that is to have the different classes of shares. A good example of that is Facebook. So when we're looking at Facebook, Mark Zuckerberg owns the shares that allow him to control the company.
Okay.
So regardless of how many shareholders there are, how much money is put in, he is the one who will determine.
Okay.
So that's a good way to insulate yourself, the different classes of shares. The second way to insulate yourself is intellectual property rights. Who owns the intellectual property rights for the product, service, innovation that you've come up with?
All right.
If you own the intellectual property rights, then people can invest in it, but they cannot take it from you because you are the owner.
Okay.
And owning intellectual property rights and having it registered, that is so important. If the intellectual property right is not duly registered, it cannot be protected.
Okay.
So it has to be registered for you to be able to receive the protection of the law.
And registered locally.
Yes.
Okay, that's a very, okay, sorry, please
When
go
we're
on.
looking at registered, I like that you brought in the aspect of locally because yes, it can be registered locally, but it can also be registered internationally and worldwide.
All right.
So we have Kenya Intellectual Property Institute, which is KIPI, who does the registration locally, but there's also World Intellectual Property Organization that governs all of the intellectual property all over the world. So you need to determine this innovation of yours, this invention of yours, this idea of yours, to what magnitude do you want to protect it?
Okay.
And when you're doing it, you have to be very deliberate about it. I would urge that you engage a legal professional because if you do a search for a certain intellectual property protection in Kenya, and then as the search is being conducted, you determine that you want to do the same in Uganda.
Yes.
You won't be able to do that because the Uganda Intellectual Property Institute will note that that particular right you want to protect is already protected in Kenya.
Okay.
So you cannot do it
so
because
you
it is
cannot do
protected.
it's already
here.
protected here. Okay.
So you,
All right, sorry, please finish. I cut you.
it's perfectly right.
Okay.
There's a way you have to go about it to ensure that you determine the territories in which you want to have the right protected so that you do it simultaneously.
Okay, so you actually just need legal counsel. You need a legal strategy, so to speak.
Yes, yes.
Okay, so the final question I'm going to ask you, and this is both for public and the private segment, is there a registry for this intellectual property rights that companies keep internally?
Yes. Well, not kept by the companies internally, but
Okay.
maintained by the government, because the government is the registrar of the intellectual property rights. So it is possible for you as a private individual to go and do a search to determine who owns these particular intellectual property rights. So for instance, if it's a trademark and you want to determine who owns the trademark,
Yes.
you're able to apply to Kenya Intellectual Property Institute and do a search for that trademark, and it will bring back the results and let you know who owns the trademark and what are the rights affiliated to that trademark.
Okay, I ask that because now when I come back as we're concluding the show, when you're looking at the Nairobi Securities Exchange, so typically we tend to focus on the technicalities. Is the price up? Is it down? Is it doing better? The fundamentals. What's the business environment? Is it doing better? But then we have seen an element of a space where there's innovation and there's an intermingling between the different industries. So you'll find that, for instance, Safaricom has its M-Pesa, but now this M-Pesa is opened up to Equity, to KCB, to Cooperative Bank. But then you've actually opened my eyes to an element of legal ranking, or giving each company a legal rank. Is it doing well and is it doing badly?
Exactly.
So when I look at the intellectual property registration, would I be able to know if some of these companies listed on the NSC have IP rights to some of the products and services that they give to the market?
If you do a search, then definitely you will be able to get a result back letting you know which intellectual property rights have been registered and to whom they are registered.
And this would be with the KP entity?
Exactly.
Okay,
Yeah.
that's interesting. Maybe I have a bit more reading to do with regards to this, just to try and look for another, because it's an advantage. That's a legal and competitive
It's
advantage that
definitely
you
a
have there.
competitive advantage.
Okay.
There is something that I would like to share as far as registration of the intellectual property rights.
Yes.
There are certain individuals that tend to shy away from the registration of it because it requires full disclosure
Of
of
what?
how exactly you do it.
Okay.
Let me give an example of Coca-Cola, possibly the most famous example. Coca-Cola purposely did not register their formula because for them to have that protected, they would have to disclose every single element within that formula and the method in which it is combined.
Wow.
And they sought to have that not disclosed so that they can protect it internally for the long run.
Okay.
The danger with that is that you leave people room to experiment and possibly come up with the exact same formula and take the protection.
Okay.
When it comes to the registration of the protection, it is first come, first
served. All right.
So if you come up with something and I come up with it, you came up with it first, but I registered it first.
First
I can
come,
go to
first
court and
served.
stop you
Wow.
from using it.
We really do need a lawyer. So we're coming to the end of our show. But is there any other pertinent issue that you want to bring up when you're looking at the legal due diligence with regards to investments?
I think the last thing that I would want to say, possibly as a summation, is when you're looking at the legal due diligence, it is not any one thing that you need to look out for. It is
Okay.
a combination of things.
All right.
Because it is not any one thing that will come and topple your investment. It is all of these things working together that are going to protect your investment. And if even one of these elements is missing, then your investment is in jeopardy.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much. That was Mr. Patrick MWANCHA. He is the Group General Manager of AMC Group Africa. And we're talking about legal due diligence when it comes to investments. It's always very interesting to speak to a lawyer because you can't just end the show anyhowly. So in summation, as lawyers would speak, in summation, you really do need to do your legal due diligence, whether at a personal level or at a corporate level. The fact that you're an investor on the NSC does not shield you from following the same considerations when you're investing outside of the NSC. So whether you're going to talk to legal counsel or even more importantly, for your own benefit and for your own research, go through the IPO processes or the memorandums of association of some of these companies. If you go through the IPO memos, you will find that there's always an element of a legal due diligence, and you can use that as a reference for your checklist over and above to seeking legal counsel before you make any investments. We're always here, but we need you to protect your investments and protect yourself over the weekend. See you again next week on Monday at 2:30. Good afternoon.